I want to start with two sentences said 1 week apart by two people on the same side. Sentence 1. America's top diplomat said no country is allowed to charge tolls on an international waterway, that doing so breaks international law. Sentence 2. 1 week later, the president of that same country announced the U.S. would charge a 20% fee on every ship passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Same government, same week. Two completely opposite positions on the same rule. Now, you could write that off as just politics. Leaders contradict themselves all the time. That's not exactly breaking news. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I think this flip tells you something real about where the United States actually is in this fight, and why, even though the U.S. Navy is the most powerful maritime force that has ever existed, this blockade may struggle to deliver the win Washington wants. Today, what actually happened this week in the Gulf? Why the administration reversed its own position, and 3 specific things I'd watch over the next few days to see who's actually winning. Let's get into it. What actually happened? Let's get the facts straight first, because a lot of the coverage this week has been chaotic. A ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran that was reached last month had been holding, shakily. Then, over the past weekend, fighting reignited. Iran's Revolutionary Guard fired on a commercial vessel in the strait and declared the waterway closed. The U.S. responded with fresh strikes on Iranian targets. Iran fired back at targets in Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman. By Monday, President Trump had declared the earlier ceasefire memorandum over. Then came the announcement that's driving this whole conversation. The U.S. said it would reimpose a full naval blockade targeting Iranian ports and vessels specifically, set to begin at 4 p.m. Eastern on July 14th. Trump framed it carefully. This isn't a blockade of the strait itself, he said. It's a blockade of Iran's ships and Iran's customers. Everyone else, in his words, gets fair and open use of the strait. And in exchange for keeping the strait open and safe for everyone else, the U.S. announced it would charge a 20% fee on cargo shipped through, with Trump declaring America would now be the guardian of the Hormuz Strait. Here's the twist that got my attention. Iran's own foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, didn't reject the logic of a toll. He essentially agreed with it, arguing that whoever provides secure passage should get compensated, but then said Iran, not the U.S., is the one who gets to decide who provides that security and collects that fee. He then literally haggled the number, saying 20% is too much, and Iran would offer something fair. Think about how strange that exchange is. The U.S. spent months, publicly, arguing that mandatory tolls on an international waterway are illegal. That's been Washington's consistent position for decades, reaffirmed just weeks earlier by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Then Washington adopts the exact toll logic it had been condemning. And Iran's response wasn't, tolls are illegal. It was, we'll set the price. Meanwhile, the market reaction has been immediate and measurable. Crossings through the strait dropped by more than half in a week. Oil prices climbed, with Brent crude pushing above $83 a barrel. U.S. gas prices ticked up too. This is a choke point carrying roughly a fifth of the world's oil, so even a partial slowdown ripples through fuel prices globally within days, not weeks. That's the surface level story. Now let's talk about why it happened and why the framing matters more than the headline. The real question, why did Washington flip? I want to offer you a lens here that isn't about Trump broke his word, because I think that's too shallow an explanation and it doesn't tell you anything useful about what happens next. Here's a more useful question. When does a dominant power break its own rules? Political scientists who study great powers have a pretty consistent answer to this, going back decades. A dominant power writes rules when it can get what it wants through those rules. It breaks its own rules when it starts to suspect the rules alone aren't getting the job done anymore. For 80 years, the U.S. Navy has kept Hormuz open essentially as a public service, not out of charity, but because an open strait means cheap, stable oil, which benefits the U.S. economy and its allies more than it costs to patrol. That arrangement only works as long as everyone believes Washington will keep providing that service without trying to extract direct payment for it. The moment Washington starts charging admission to a road it built for everyone, it's signaling something. That the old arrangement, provide stability, get indirect benefit, isn't paying off the way it used to, and Washington wants a more direct, immediate return. That's one way to read the toll. It's less about the money itself, 20% on cargo is real money, but it's not why a nuclear-armed military superpower changes its entire posture, and more about signaling frustration. This is a public statement that says, "We are tired of paying for a service the whole world uses for free." But here's the problem with that move, and it's the same problem that's shown up historically anytime a dominant power tries to convert quiet influence into loud coercion. You can't force people to respect a system while simultaneously admitting you no longer trust the system to work in your favor. The two moves undercut each other. You can see that tension play out immediately in the reactions. The UK signaled it won't help enforce this blockade. Brazil's president called it bluntly an act of piracy. The body that actually governs international shipping law rejected the legal basis for a mandatory toll outright. None of these are minor diplomatic footnotes. They're allies and international bodies publicly declining to back the enforcement mechanism of America's own policy within 48 hours of the announcement. And that gets to the deeper issue. Rules only work if the rulemaker follows them too. The moment the U.S. abandons the position it held 1 week earlier that tolls on international waterways are illegal, it hands every other country a ready-made argument for why they don't have to follow Washington's version of the rules either. Iran didn't even need to argue the toll was wrong. It just needed to say, "Fine, we agree with the logic, we'll be the ones setting the price." That's a far more damaging response than outright defiance, because it doesn't reject American logic, it steals it. Part 3. The escape hatch, why a southern blockade isn't a full blockade. Now let's get to the part almost nobody is talking about, and it's the reason I think this blockade has a much lower ceiling than the headlines suggest. Look at a map of Iran. The blockade targets Iran's ports and coastal waters in the south, the Persian Gulf side. But Iran isn't a country with only one coastline. It also borders the Caspian Sea and shares a long northern border with Azerbaijan, neither of which the US Navy has any presence in, legally or physically. And this week, while the blockade announcement was dominating headlines, a second, quieter story was developing on that northern side. Russian and Iranian energy ministers met in Tehran and confirmed they'd resolved almost all the remaining terms of a long-discussed gas supply deal. Russian gas flowing into Iran through Azerbaijan. The initial volume is modest, around 2 billion cubic meters a year, but the framework allows scaling up to as much as 55 billion cubic meters, using pipeline infrastructure that, critically, already exists. This isn't a "we're going to build a pipeline someday" announcement. It's a "we're going to start using capacity that's already sitting there" announcement. Why does that matter for a naval blockade? Because a blockade's entire theory of victory is cut off the money and the resources, and the target has to negotiate. But if Iran can offset a meaningful chunk of its domestic energy needs in its northern provinces using imported Russian gas, it frees up Iran's own southern gas reserves for other uses, keeping the grid running, keeping industry going, without needing to move a single barrel through a blockaded port. The blockade closes the front door. This deal cracks open a side door that the US simply has no jurisdiction to touch. To be fair to the blockade strategy, this isn't an instant fix for Iran. Scaling a gas relationship from 2 billion to 55 billion cubic meters doesn't happen overnight, and in the months before that capacity is fully built out, sustained economic pressure could still bite. The US Navy remains, by a wide margin, the most capable maritime force on the planet. And historically, sanctions plus blockade pressure has forced smaller states back to the table before. That argument isn't nothing. But here's why I think it still falls short. The relevant comparison isn't pipeline built from zero versus no pipeline. It's existing infrastructure redirected versus new infrastructure built from scratch. The first one is a matter of months and paperwork. The second is a matter of years. Every week, the Russia-Iran energy relationship deepens, the blockade's leverage shrinks a little further, and unlike a blockade, which has to be maintained constantly at enormous cost, a pipeline relationship once running just runs. There's also a harder constraint sitting underneath all of this. Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant was built with Russian involvement, and Russian personnel and materials remain connected to the site. Any escalation path that seriously threatens Iran's energy or nuclear infrastructure runs the risk of drawing Russia directly into the consequences, not as a hypothetical, but as a physical reality, given what's stored there. That's a ceiling on how far this can escalate militarily without turning into a completely different, far more dangerous kind of crisis. Put those two things together, a Caspian-side energy lifeline the Navy can't reach, and a nuclear site that raises the cost of going further militarily, and you get a blockade that can hurt, but probably can't finish the job the way its architects are hoping. 3 things to watch this week. I don't want to just hand you a theory and walk away. I want to give you specific things to track so you can judge for yourself whether this analysis holds up. 1. The oil price, specifically whether Brent crude stays above that $80.85 range. Every day it stays elevated is a day the blockade is visibly working in the narrow sense of disrupting trade. But it's also a day of rising political cost at home, with gas prices creeping up right as attention turns toward the midterms. Watch which pressure breaks first, Iran's economy or American gas prices. 2. How Iran's neighbors and trading partners respond. Countries like India sit awkwardly in the middle here, strategic partners of the US, but also heavily invested in trade routes running through Iran, and now dealing with real casualties from strikes on commercial shipping. Watch whether countries like this stay quiet, criticize Iran, or start pushing back on the US approach. That will tell you which way the rest of the world is actually leaning, regardless of what official statements say. 3. How far the Russia-Iran energy relationship moves beyond gas. Right now, what's on the table is economic, energy supply, trade routes. If you start seeing language about security cooperation or defense commitments layered on top of the energy deal, that's a meaningfully different situation. That's Russia shifting from economic partner to something closer to a strategic backer. And that changes the entire risk calculus for Washington. Here's what I want you to sit with. The headline this week is US blockades Iran. But the more interesting story, I'd argue, is what happened in the same 48-hour window on the other side of the map. A resource-sharing deal that quietly reduces how much the blockade can actually accomplish. That's usually how these standoffs go, historically. The dramatic, visible move, ships, warships, blockade announcements, gets all the coverage. The quieter move, a pipeline agreement, a diplomatic visit, an energy swap, gets a fraction of the attention, but often ends up mattering more for how the situation actually resolves. And on the question I opened with, why would a country publicly abandon its own stated legal position on tolls within a single week? I'd argue the honest answer isn't hypocrisy. It's closer to pressure. A dominant power doesn't usually break its own rules when things are going according to plan. It breaks them when the old playbook stops producing results fast enough, and reaching for direct coercion starts to look more appealing than it used to. Whether that gamble pays off for Washington is genuinely an open question. I'm not going to pretend I know how this ends. But the early signals, allies declining to enforce it, the international shipping body rejecting the legal basis, and a resource lifeline opening on Iran's northern border, suggest the blockade is going to have to work a lot harder than its 4 p.m. Tuesday start time made it sound. Let me know what you think in the comments, particularly if you think I'm being too skeptical of the blockade's chances. Subscribe if you want the next update on this as it develops, because I don't think this is over by a long shot.